Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we actually have to talk about global cybercrime because it just took a major hit the last couple of days, but temporarily. Now, this is actually interesting, and the backdrop that I'm going to use before I just dive into my own thoughts on tangents, because, that's what I do, is basically an article from the Associated Press by Frank Bajak and Stephanie Dazio, and thank you very much for this write-up. It's pretty good. Now, here's what happened. U.S. officials this past Tuesday said that the FBI and its European partner, specifically Europol, infiltrated and seized control of a major global malware network used for more than 15 years to commit just a whole bunch of online crimes against you, me, and everybody else. And so obviously that's a huge thing. This was a major player in ransomware, and that's why we're talking about it. So basically what we are talking about is this essentially the attack that the FBI and Europol launched because they remotely removed the malicious software agent known as CACBot, or Quackbot, as I like to call them, Quackbot. I've heard it, for the record, both ways as I was doing my research, but Quackbot, and you will find out in a moment why Quackbot, I think, is the preferred term. The FBI and Europol were able to remove Quackbot from thousands of infected computers worldwide. Quote, nearly every sector of the economy has been victimized by Quackbot. Now, that's according to Martin Estrada, the U.S. attorney in Los Angeles, talking on Tuesday to the press about this global takedown. He also said that this criminal network had facilitated about 40 ransomware attacks itself, not to mention ransomware as a service, over a period of 18 months that investigators said netted the Quackbot administrator about $58 million US. Obviously, that's in cryptocurrency. Officials also said they seized $8.6 million in crypto, but no arrests have been announced or that I could find. And obviously, this news is coming from Tuesday and Wednesday. So just as a snippet, at least here in the United States, some of Quackbot's ransomware victims included an engineering firm based in the state of Illinois, financial service organizations in Alabama and Kansas, along with a defense manufacturer in Maryland and a food distribution company in Southern California. The investigation is still ongoing, and essentially officials are not saying where the administrators of the malware essentially were located, although researchers point to Russia or former Soviet states. These kinds of attacks are very typically out of basically the former Soviet bloc, Eastern Europe or Russia. Russia gives essentially a shield to these kinds of criminals. Look at REvil, look at Clop, et cetera, et cetera. And so Quackbot is one of those things. And if they are sitting in Russia right now, given that there's a war on, we're not seeing any of those people in the same way that when Russia in 2022, basically before the start of the Ukraine war, very publicly arrested REvil, the United States immediately asked for extradition, knowing that they're never going to get it, but we have to ask. And what happened to REvil? They're working for Russian intelligence now, breaking into Ukraine. So let's talk a bit about the nuts and bolts of this particular malware and its botnet. Now, this is a malware loader, so basically it's essentially a digital Swiss Army knife for cyber criminals, and essentially it's been known as either Pink Slip Bot and Qbot, and this was leveraged to cause hundreds of millions of dollars in damage when it first started appearing in 2008, although initially it was an information stealing bank Trojan, meaning it would masquerade as essentially, oh, I have an account at Chase. It would look exactly like a Chase app or a Chase login. I would give it my credentials to my account, and then boom, they could just log into my Chase account and transfer out all of my money. Now, millions of people in basically countries all over the globe have been affected by this. Now, typically delivered via phishing email, meaning it looks legitimate, like it's coming from that source. Quackbot gave criminal hackers initial access to the computers that they were affected. By virtue of that, essentially what they were doing was installing what is known as CNC, or command and control. So I gain essentially access into your computer. I have full access. And by virtue of that, I can start transferring things to your computer or removing things from it. So, for example, they could basically deploy payloads, including ransomware. They could steal sensitive information, gather intelligence on victims to facilitate financial fraud and crimes, all those kinds of things. So they can act as fake tech support, romance scams, all this kind of stuff. And essentially having that platform and that understanding of who that person was and their sensitive information, you can pretty much do what you wanted. Now, the Quackbot network quote, was literally feeding the global cybercrime supply chain, end quote. That's according to Donald Alway, assistant director in charge of the FBI's LA office, calling it, quote, one of the most devastating cyber criminal tools in history, end quote. It was pretty prolific, but there are plenty out there. Now, the most commonly detected malware in the first half of 2023, Quackbot actually impacted about 1 in 10 corporate networks and accounted for about 30% of attacks globally. And that is according to cybersecurity firms that have been doing the research on Quackbot for the last year or so. So obviously that is a major player in ransomware delivery, as not to mention information theft and everything that I just mentioned. So such initial access tools obviously allow extortionist ransomware gangs to skip the initial step of actually having to break into computer networks, making them, basically very easy to use and very popular. And so when you're looking at, let's say, gangs, in Russia or Eastern Europe, Russian-speaking gangs, if you will, essentially they can basically wreak havoc without having to break into things if they can successfully phish you. So they can disrupt schools, businesses, governments, all that kind of stuff. Now, beginning this past Friday, in an operation that officials dubbed Duck Hunt, which is why I like calling it Quackbot and not Cackbot, although, again, I've heard it both ways. The FBI, along with Europol and other law enforcement and justice partners in France, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Romania, and Latvia, seized more than 50 Quackbot servers and identified more than 700,000 infected or zombied computers, more than 200 of them, for the record, here in the United States, effectively cutting off criminals from access to that massive botnet that they had created. The FBI, on top of it, as basically the Europeans were raiding, the FBI here in the United States then used seized Quackbot infrastructure to remotely dispatch updates that deleted the malware from thousands of infected computers, meaning you could have been infected by Quackbot, they could have been running CNC or command and control on your computer unbeknownst to you. The FBI just did you a favor because they pushed essentially the uninstall to remove that. That said, even though they did that, that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't other payloads. Meaning, if your computer, let's say, was infected with various forms of, credential stealers or ransomware or whatever it is, just simply removing Quackbot, that command and control connection to access and launch those things, doesn't mean you still don't have infections on your computer. This is why we need good threat detection systems in our life, like firewalls, endpoint detection response, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a senior FBI official briefing reporters on the condition that they further not be identified called that number fluid and, and cautioned that other malware may have remained on there. So there you go. I just made his point for him ahead of time. Now, this was, for the record, the FBI's biggest, I can't talk today. This was the FBI's biggest success against cyber criminals, actually, interestingly enough, since this past January when they took down Hive. That also is a prolific ransomware gang. Now, the reason why I say this is temporary, as this is always temporary, is there are a ton of variants out there. It's not like all the code for Quackbot simply went away. Others can leverage it, create variants on it, not to mention there are other competitors to Quackbot as well that are out there. If you think 700,000 zombied computers is a lot, or infected computers with command and control, we have tens of millions, if not possibly billions of them potentially out there. So we have a huge amount of work to do. That said, this disrupts gangs in the temporary, in the sense that they're leveraging this, they get into that groove, they know the product inside and out, and now, boom, basically we pulled the rug out from under them. And so by virtue of that, they're going to have to change up the game, switch, all that kind of stuff. So what we may see is a slowdown temporarily in ransomware gangs as gangs shift infrastructure, develop new botnets, attempt to replace Quackbot with something else, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to see what happens here. But at the end of the day, like I said, like the war on drugs here in the United States, the cartels are always on it. And, if they're not finding ways to go over the border, they'll fly over the border. They'll dig under a tunnel under the border. They'll use water borders, et cetera, any which way they can to basically get their product into the United States. And it's no different here. So you've got a lot of smart people doing a lot of criminal things, and they're going to find other workarounds and other ways to obfuscate themselves, because quite frankly, if Quackbot is a lesson to the good guys, it's also a lesson to the bad. And I think that's an important note to take. And so while I'm happy about this news, the war is by far from over. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private. Thanks, everybody.